Hey guys, tonight we're trading our comfortable airplane seats for something far more terrifying. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, October 13th, 1972. The flight that turned a routine trip to Chile into 2 days of frozen hell in the Andes Mountains, where young rugby players discovered that survival isn't about motivational posters or protein shakes, but about making impossible choices that would haunt civilized people forever. So before we climb aboard this particular death trap, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy descending into the darker corners of human endurance with me. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you, though hopefully you're somewhere warm with easy access to food, because after tonight's story, you'll never take either for granted again. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, because we're heading somewhere very, very cold. And let's ease into tonight's journey together through one of history's most harrowing survival ordeals. So, you think you could survive a plane crash in the Andes Mountains? Precious. Really? Like a goldfish believing it could navigate the Pacific Ocean. You've watched every survival show, you've read Into the Wild, and you once went camping where you had to walk 30 whole yards to the bathroom. You're practically Bear Grylls, aren't you? Well, buckle up, literally, because we're about to take a little trip to October 13th, 1972, aboard a flight that's going to teach you exactly why nature doesn't care about your weekend hiking experience or your emergency kit from Amazon. And spoiler alert, you're not walking away from this one with a heartwarming story about human resilience, you're walking away as dinner. So you think you're tough? You think you could handle extreme survival? You've watched every Bear Grylls episode, you've binged Survivorman, and you once ate a protein bar that was technically expired. You're practically Bear Grylls himself, aren't you? Well, buckle up, literally, because we're about to take a little trip to October 13th, 1972, aboard Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. And spoiler alert, you're not making it home for dinner. You're sitting in seat 23B, middle seat naturally, because your travel agent had the customer service skills of a particularly vindictive DMV employee. To your left is Carlos, a rugby player whose shoulders are roughly the width of a small aircraft carrier. To your right is another rugby player, Miguel, whose idea of personal space extends approximately to the next province. You're already questioning your life choices, and the plane hasn't even taken off yet. The Fairchild FH-227D stretches out before you like a metallic sausage casing stuffed with 45 souls, most of whom are members of the Old Christians Club rugby team from Uruguay. These aren't your average weekend warriors playing beer league. These are legitimate athletes. Young men in their physical prime, bursting with testosterone and the kind of confidence that comes from regularly tackling people twice your size. You, on the other hand, get winded walking up 2 flights of stairs and consider reaching for the TV remote a cardiovascular workout. The plane itself is making sounds that can best be described as mechanical indigestion. Every bolt seems to be engaged in a philosophical debate about whether it wants to stay attached. The seats are about as comfortable as church pews designed by someone who fundamentally misunderstood the concept of human anatomy. Your knees are already pressed against the seat in front of you, and you haven't even reached cruising altitude. This is going to be a long flight to Chile. Assuming you make it there at all. Captain Julio Cesar Ferradas is up front, probably wondering why he didn't listen to his mother and become an accountant. Co-pilot Dante Echeikter La Guerrera is running through pre-flight checks with the enthusiasm of someone filling out tax forms. Neither of them knows that in a few hours, they'll both be dead, and you'll be wishing you were too. The weather outside looks like God spilled a bucket of grey paint across the sky. The Andes Mountains loom ahead like the vertebrae of some impossibly massive prehistoric beast, their peaks disappearing into clouds that seem less like meteorological phenomena and more like malevolent entities waiting to swallow aircraft whole. You glance out the window and immediately regret it. Those mountains look like they were designed by someone who took the concept of hostile terrain as a personal challenge. Your fellow passengers are chatting excitedly about the upcoming rugby match, their voices filled with the kind of youthful optimism that makes you simultaneously nostalgic and nauseous. They're talking about strategy, about the Chilean team they're going to face, about the celebratory dinner they'll have after their inevitable victory. You're thinking about the airplane peanuts and wondering if there'll be enough to sustain you if this flight gets delayed. Roberto Canessa, all of 19 years old, is sitting 3 rows up, probably dreaming about becoming a doctor. Nando Paraido, 22 and built like he was carved from granite by sculptors who specialized in athletic perfection, is laughing at something his teammate said. These young men are at the peak of their physical condition, trained athletes with the kind of mental toughness that comes from years of competitive sports. They have quick reflexes, strong bones, and the kind of cardiovascular health that would make their doctors weep with joy. You have none of these things. Your idea of physical training is carrying groceries up to your apartment, and even that leaves you slightly breathless. Your reflexes are so slow that you once got startled by your own shadow. Your bones have the structural integrity of wet breadsticks, and your cardiovascular system would be rejected by an insurance company for being too high, risk even for their worst policies. The plane lurches slightly as it begins to taxi, and you grip the armrests with the desperation of someone who has suddenly realized that they are, in fact, sitting inside a metal tube that is about to be hurled through the sky at several hundred miles per hour. The physics of flight have never made sense to you. Something this heavy shouldn't be able to fly. It's like watching a hippo attempt bullet, theoretically possible, but deeply unsettling to witness. Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas announces over the intercom that the flight to Santiago should take about 3.5 hours, weather permitting. He sounds confident, professional. He has no idea that in approximately 2 hours and 18 minutes, he'll be flying directly into a mountain at 180 miles per hour. You don't know this either, but somewhere in your lizard brain, that primal part of your nervous system that kept your ancestors alive long enough to produce you, alarm bells are going off like a 4-alarm fire in a fireworks factory. The takeoff is surprisingly smooth, which only serves to make you more nervous. In your experience, things that start well have an unfortunate tendency to end catastrophically. You've never been in a plane crash, but you've seen enough movies to know that it's never the turbulence that gets you. It's the sudden, shocking silence when the engines cut out, followed by the kind of rapid descent that makes your stomach relocate to somewhere around your throat. As the Fairchild climbs through the clouds, you try to distract yourself by observing your fellow passengers. The rugby players are a remarkable specimen of human optimization. Their bodies are machines designed for impact, collision, and recovery. They have the kind of muscle mass that doesn't come from protein shakes and weekend gym sessions. This is functional strength, the kind developed through years of being systematically brutalized on athletic fields and somehow managing to bounce back. Fernando Paredo, they call him Nando, is perhaps the most impressive of the bunch. He's got the build of someone who could probably bench press a small car, and the kind of facial bone structure that suggests his ancestors were successful at everything from hunting mammoths to impressing potential mates. His hands look like they could crush walnuts without conscious effort. He's 22 years old and probably hasn't had a sick day in his life. You sneeze, and 3 people automatically move slightly away from you. The conversation around you is in Spanish, which you understand about as well as you understand quantum mechanics. You catch occasional words, rugby, Santiago, partido, but mostly you're left to construct meaning from tone and gesture like some sort of linguistic archaeologist. What you can understand is the camaraderie, the easy friendship that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. These young men have been through battles together, metaphorical ones on rugby pitches, where they've learned to trust each other, to work as a unit, to push through pain and exhaustion for the sake of the team. Your closest approximation to team sports was that one time you joined a bowling league, which lasted exactly 3 weeks before you quit because the shoes gave you athlete's foot. About an hour into the flight, the weather starts to turn ugly. What began as occasional turbulence becomes a sustained assault on both the aircraft and your digestive system. The Fairchild is being knocked around like a toy in a washing machine, and every bump sends your stomach on a brief tour of your ribcage. The rugby players seem largely unaffected. They're used to impact, to being tossed around, to maintaining their composure, while their environment becomes actively hostile. You're turning a shade of green that would make seasoned sailors nauseous just looking at you. The mountains below are getting closer, their peaks stabbing up through the cloud cover like the fingers of buried giants. The Andes are not gentle mountains, they're young, aggressive peaks that seem to actively resent the presence of anything soft or living. They've been grinding aircraft into scrap metal for decades, and they're particularly good at it. The air currents around these peaks are vicious, unpredictable things that can swat an aircraft out of the sky with casual indifference. Captain Ferradas is fighting the controls now, trying to maintain altitude and heading while the wind does its best to turn his aircraft into an expensive lawn dart. The Fairchild wasn't designed for this kind of weather. It's a workhorse aircraft, reliable and sturdy, but it's being asked to perform in conditions that would challenge much larger, more sophisticated planes. You don't know any of this technical detail, of course. All you know is that the plane is making sounds like a washing machine full of silverware, and the view out your window has become a nausea-eating blur of grey clouds and occasional glimpses of rocky death waiting below. Nando Peredo glances back at you, with what might be concern or might be mild disgust. It's hard to tell when you're focused primarily on not vomiting on his shoes. He says something in Spanish that sounds encouraging, but for all you know he's commenting on your complexion or placing bets on how long before you lose your breakfast. The thing about these rugby players is that they're not just physically tough, they're mentally prepared for adversity. They've spent years learning how to function under pressure, how to make quick decisions when everything is chaos, how to work together when individual survival might depend on team cooperation. They know how to ration energy, how to push through pain, how to maintain morale when everything is going wrong. Your idea of adversity is when the coffee shop runs out of your preferred non-dairy milk alternative. At 3:21 p.m. local time, the world ends. It doesn't end dramatically, with explosions and heroic music. It ends with a sound like the universe clearing its throat, followed by a silence that seems to stretch for hours, but probably lasts less than a second. The right wing of the Fairchild FH227D clips a mountain peak at approximately 180 miles per hour, which is roughly the speed at which your life transitions from routine flight to physics experiment with fatal results. The impact shears off the wing like a giant invisible knife, and suddenly you're not in an airplane anymore, you're in a missile. The aircraft spins, tumbles, and begins its final descent toward Glacier de las Grimas, which translates to Glacier of Tears, a name that seems almost cruelly prophetic under the circumstances. During those few seconds of uncontrolled flight, while the aircraft is cartwheeling through the air like a discarded soda can, you have enough time to realize several things. First, you're probably going to die. Second, you should have written a will. Third, you really should have called your mother more often. Fourth, you're surrounded by people who are significantly better equipped to survive whatever comes next than you are. The Fairchild hits the glacier at approximately 200 miles per hour, which is fast enough to turn human beings into what forensic investigators politely call biological matter. The impact kills Captain Ferradas instantly, along with co-pilot Lagarara and most of the passengers in the front of the aircraft. The tail section, where you're sitting, breaks off and slides down the glacier like a toboggan designed by someone with a very dark sense of humor. You survive the impact, which is both miraculous and deeply unfortunate. When you regain consciousness, you're hanging upside down in what used to be an airplane seat, but now more closely resembles abstract art. Your head feels like someone has been using it as a piñata. Your left arm is pointing in a direction that arms typically don't point, and there's a taste in your mouth that suggests several of your teeth have relocated to your throat. Around you, the groaning and crying tells you that others have also survived, though survived might be an optimistic way to describe your current condition. You're at approximately 11,500 feet above sea level, which is high enough that the air contains about as much oxygen as a politician's promise. The temperature is somewhere south of freezing, and dropping rapidly as the sun disappears behind peaks that look like they were designed by a committee of sadists. Nando Parado, who was sitting near you, is unconscious with blood streaming down his face from a head wound that would have hospitalized a normal person for months. Roberto Canessa has a broken leg, but is somehow still conscious and trying to help other passengers. These young men are absorbing injuries that would leave you bedridden for years and somehow managing to remain functional. You, meanwhile, can barely remember your own name and are seriously considering the possibility that you've died and gone to a particularly creative version of hell. The fuselage of the aircraft has come to rest at an angle that makes movement difficult and sitting upright nearly impossible. The metal is twisted and torn, creating sharp edges everywhere that seem specifically designed to inflict additional injuries on anyone foolish enough to move around. The cold is already seeping through the damaged walls, and you can see your breath forming small clouds that dissipate almost immediately in the thin air. Outside, the wind is howling like a living thing in pain, driving snow through every gap in the aircraft's damaged hull. The sound is constant, relentless, the kind of white noise that slowly drives people insane. Combined with the altitude, the cold, and the shock of the crash, it creates a sensory environment that's actively hostile to human consciousness. Roberto Canessa, despite his broken leg, is moving among the survivors, checking injuries, trying to organize some kind of medical response. He's a medical student, which means he knows enough to understand exactly how dire your situation is, but also enough to do something about it. He's calm, focused, treating this like a practical problem that can be solved through systematic application of knowledge and effort. You're sitting in a corner whimpering and wondering if your travel insurance covers acts of glacial malevolence. The initial survivor count is 28 people, though that number will drop steadily over the coming days and weeks. Some of the injured won't make it through the first night. Others will succumb to infections, internal injuries, or simply the accumulated stress of trying to survive in an environment that was never intended to support human life. But you don't know any of this yet. Right now, you're focused on more immediate concerns, like the fact that you can't feel your feet and your broken arm is sending shooting pains up to your shoulder every time you move. The altitude is making you dizzy and nauseous, and the cold is seeping into your bones with the persistence of a particularly dedicated creditor. The rugby players, even the injured ones, are already beginning to organize. They're taking inventory of resources, checking on the most seriously wounded, discussing options. These are young men who are used to being part of a team, used to following leadership, used to working together toward common goals. They have the mental framework for collective action under pressure. You have the mental framework of someone whose biggest group decision is usually what to order for office lunch. Night falls with the speed and finality of a guillotine blade. At this altitude, in these mountains, darkness isn't just the absence of light, it's the presence of something actively malevolent. The temperature drops to well below freezing, and the wind picks up until it sounds like the aircraft is being systematically disassembled by invisible hands. The survivors huddle together for warmth, which is both practical and deeply uncomfortable. You're pressed against people you don't know, sharing body heat, and trying not to think about the fact that some of the warmth you're feeling is probably blood from various injuries. The smell inside the fuselage is already becoming unpleasant, a mixture of fuel, blood, fear, and the distinctly organic scent of people who have been through severe trauma. You're not built for this kind of intimacy, physical or emotional. Your idea of roughing it is staying in a hotel without room service. The thought of spending weeks pressed against strangers, sharing their bodily fluids and breathing their exhalations, is almost as terrifying as the prospect of freezing to death. The rugby players seem to handle the crowding better. They're used to physical contact, to being pressed together in scrums and tackles, to treating their bodies as functional tools rather than sacred temples. They organize sleeping arrangements with the efficiency of people who have shared locker rooms and team buses, who understand that survival sometimes requires sacrificing personal comfort for group welfare. You lie awake most of the first night, listening to the wind and the occasional groan from your fellow survivors, wondering how long it will take for rescue teams to find you. In your mind, helicopters should already be on their way. Search parties should be combing the mountains. Your disappearance should be front page news. with governments mobilizing resources and experts consulting maps. What you don't realize is that the crash site is virtually invisible from the air, nestled in a valley between peaks that all look identical from above. The aircraft's emergency beacon was destroyed in the crash, and the white fuselage blends perfectly with the snow and ice. Search teams will spend weeks looking in the wrong places, following false leads, and gradually reducing their efforts as the statistical probability of finding survivors approaches zero. The rugby players understand this better than you do. They've played in environments where you can't count on outside help, where victory depends entirely on what you can accomplish with the resources and people immediately available. They're already beginning to think in terms of self-rescue, of long-term survival, of the possibility that they might be here for weeks or even months. You're still waiting for someone to show up with hot chocolate and a warm blanket. On the second day, the reality of your situation begins to settle in like a tumor in your consciousness. The most seriously injured passengers are clearly dying, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Roberto Canessa and the other medical students are doing their best with virtually no supplies, but they're treating massive internal injuries with aspirin and optimism. The food situation is also becoming clear. The aircraft was carrying some snacks and beverages for the flight, but it was supposed to be a 3.5-hour trip, not an extended survival situation. What food exists has been scattered and damaged in the crash. Your total supplies consist of some chocolate bars, wine, and miscellaneous items that wouldn't sustain a house cat for more than a few days. The rugby players begin rationing immediately, dividing the available food into carefully measured portions that might last a week if everyone exercises remarkable self-control. They're used to managing their nutrition, to thinking about food as fuel rather than entertainment. They can calculate calories and understand the relationship between intake and physical performance. You, on the other hand, become obsessed with the chocolate. You catch yourself thinking about it constantly, calculating how long until the next small piece, wondering if there might be some hidden stash somewhere in the wreckage. You've never been truly hungry before. You've been peckish, or eager for lunch, or craving specific foods. But you've never experienced the kind of systematic starvation that makes your body begin consuming itself. By the third day, hunger has become a constant companion, like a small animal gnawing at your insides. The rugby players seem to handle it better, perhaps because their bodies are used to controlled deprivation, to training diets and weight management. They understand hunger as a temporary condition that can be endured and overcome. Your body, accustomed to regular meals and frequent snacks, begins rebelling almost immediately. You feel weak, dizzy, irritable. Your ability to think clearly becomes compromised, and you find yourself making poor decisions with increasing frequency. The thin air isn't helping, your brain isn't getting enough oxygen to function optimally, and the combination of altitude sickness and hunger creates a mental fog that makes everything seem surreal and distant. The cold is another constant enemy. At this altitude, even during the day, temperatures rarely rise above freezing. At night, they drop well below zero, and the wind makes it feel even colder. The aircraft fuselage provides some shelter, but it's hardly adequate. The metal conducts cold like it was designed for the purpose, and every surface you touch seems to leach heat from your body. The rugby players have some advantages here too. Their muscle mass provides better insulation, and their cardiovascular systems can more efficiently distribute what heat their bodies produce. They understand the importance of staying dry, of conserving energy, of sharing body heat effectively. You're already showing signs of hypothermia by the fourth day. Your fingers are turning white, you're shivering uncontrollably, and your thinking is becoming increasingly impaired. Hypothermia doesn't just freeze you, it makes you stupid, and stupid people make fatal mistakes in survival situations. On October 17th, 4 days after the crash, you hear something that sounds like salvation, the drone of aircraft engines passing overhead.
Search planes! Rescue!
Someone has finally figured out where you are and has come to extract you from this frozen nightmare. The survivors scramble outside, waving pieces of clothing, shouting, making themselves as visible as possible against the white expanse of the glacier. The rugby players organize quickly, creating signals, reflecting sunlight with pieces of metal, doing everything possible to attract attention. The aircraft passes over, circles once, and disappears. It will be the last search plane you see. What you don't know, what none of the survivors know, is that the search has been called off. The authorities have determined that anyone who survived the initial crash couldn't possibly still be alive after more than a week in the mountains. The statistical probability of survival in these conditions is so low that continuing the search would be a waste of resources. You have been officially declared dead. This realization doesn't hit the survivors immediately, but over the following days, it becomes clear that no one is coming. The rugby players adapt to this reality with remarkable speed, shifting their focus from waiting for rescue to organizing for long-term survival. They begin exploring the crash site systematically, looking for anything that might be useful, pieces of metal that could be fashioned into tools, fabric that could provide additional insulation, any overlooked food items. You spend most of your time curled in a corner, trying to conserve body heat and wondering how your life came to this point. The mental adjustment from temporary inconvenience to indefinite survival situation is beyond your emotional resources. You've never faced a challenge that couldn't be solved by calling someone or throwing money at it, and neither of those options is available at 500 feet above sea level. The food runs out on October 21st, 8 days after the crash. This isn't a gradual reduction in rations, this is the complete exhaustion of anything remotely edible. The survivors sit in a circle, staring at empty containers and wondering how long human beings can survive without food. The answer, which Roberto Canessa knows from his medical training, is somewhere between 30 and 70 days, depending on individual health, body fat reserves, and environmental conditions. You don't have 30 days in you. You're already weak, already showing signs of malnutrition, already operating on minimal reserves. Your body fat percentage is probably somewhere around average, but average wasn't calculated for surviving in sub-Arctic conditions at high altitude. The rugby players, with their higher muscle mass and better physical condition, have significant advantages in terms of metabolic efficiency and energy reserves. On October 22nd, Roberto Canessa makes a suggestion that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. He points to the bodies of the passengers who died in the crash, preserved in the snow like items in a freezer, and speaks the words that transform this from a survival story into something much darker. "Why have to eat them?" The suggestion hits the group like a physical blow. These are Catholic young men, raised with strong moral and religious convictions, taught to respect the dead and honor human dignity. The idea of consuming human flesh violates every cultural taboo, every religious teaching, every civilized instinct they possess. But they're also dying. Slowly, systematically, inevitably dying of starvation in a place where no other food exists. The choice isn't between right and wrong, it's between survival and death, between violating their deepest beliefs and accepting extinction. The rugby players debate this decision with the seriousness it deserves. They discuss the religious implications, the moral consequences, the practical necessity. They're not monsters making a casual choice. They're human beings facing an impossible situation and trying to find a way to remain human while doing what's necessary to survive. You don't participate in this discussion. You can't. The very idea makes you physically sick, which is saying something given that you're already nauseous from altitude, sickness, and hunger. You've never faced a decision more complex than choosing between competing restaurant options. And now you're being asked to consider something that fundamentally challenges everything you believe about civilization, morality, and human nature. Some of the survivors refuse. They would rather die than compromise their principles, and several of them do exactly that. They stop eating, stop participating in group activities, and gradually fade away over the following days. Their moral purity comes at the cost of their lives, and while their choice is understandable, it also reduces the group's chances of collective survival. The rugby players, after intense debate and prayer, make the practical choice. They begin consuming the bodies of their deceased friends and fellow passengers, treating the process with as much dignity and respect as possible under the circumstances. They remove the meat carefully, trying to preserve the recognizable human features, and they share it equally among those willing to participate. You eventually join them, though it takes several more days of progressive starvation before desperation overwhelms revulsion. Your first taste of human flesh is exactly as horrific as you imagined it would be, but it's also the first real nutrition you've had in over a week. Your body responds immediately, gratefully absorbing protein and calories it desperately needs. The psychological impact is devastating. You've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed, committed an act that will define the rest of your life. Assuming you survive long enough to have a rest of your life, the guilt and horror are overwhelming, but they're balanced by the simple biological fact that you're no longer dying of starvation. The rugby players handle this transition better than you do, perhaps because their team experience has taught them how to compartmentalize difficult emotions in service of group goals. They develop rituals around the process, prayers and ceremonies that help maintain their humanity while doing what's necessary for survival. They're able to separate the practical necessity of the act from its moral implications, to treat it as medicine rather than food. You throw up after almost every meal, which is both psychologically understandable and practically wasteful. Your body desperately needs the calories and protein, but your mind can't accept what you're doing. The internal conflict between survival instinct and cultural conditioning creates a state of constant psychological distress that makes every aspect of the ordeal more difficult. As October turns into November, the weather becomes even more hostile. Winter is settling over the Andes with the inevitability of death itself, bringing temperatures that regularly drop to 30 below zero and wind speeds that can knock down anyone foolish enough to venture outside without protection. The survivors are trapped inside the fuselage for days at a time, pressed together in a space that's barely large enough for half their number. The social dynamics of the group become increasingly complex and strained. When you're confined with the same people for weeks on end, sharing their bodily functions and breathing their exhalations, personality conflicts become magnified beyond all reasonable proportion. People who would normally be friends develop intense animosities over trivial issues like sleeping arrangements or conversation topics. The rugby players have some advantages here too. They're used to close quarters, to resolving conflicts quickly and efficiently, to subordinating individual preferences for group harmony. They have established hierarchies and leadership structures that help maintain order when everyone is hungry, cold, and increasingly desperate. You don't handle the social pressure well. You've never been good with conflict, and your usual strategy of avoiding difficult people isn't available when you're trapped in a metal tube with them for 24 hours a day. You develop tensions with several other survivors over issues that would seem laughably trivial under normal circumstances. Someone using your preferred sleeping spot, someone breathing too loudly, someone taking more than their share of the communal body heat. These conflicts aren't just annoying, they're potentially fatal. In a survival situation, group cohesion can be the difference between life and death. People who can't work together, who waste energy on interpersonal drama, who undermine group morale, represent a threat to everyone's survival. The group dynamic becomes increasingly focused on collective welfare, and individual needs or preferences become subordinate to whatever serves the greater good. You're not good at subordinating your individual needs. You've never had to be. You've lived your entire life in an environment where personal comfort and individual choice were taken for granted, where the idea of sacrificing your preferences for group survival was purely theoretical. Now you're discovering that your personality is poorly adapted for collective survival, that your individualistic instincts are counterproductive when everyone's fate is interconnected. By early November, the group has been reduced to 16 survivors. Some died from their initial injuries, others from infections or exposure, a few from the accumulated stress of trying to survive in impossible conditions. Each death is both a personal tragedy and a practical resource: more meat for the survivors, more space in the fuselage, fewer mouths to feed when food becomes available. You feel guilty about thinking in these terms, but you also can't help yourself. Survival situations strip away the comfortable illusions of civilization and reveal the calculating animal that lurks beneath human consciousness. You're discovering aspects of your personality that you never knew existed, and you don't like what you're finding. The rugby players seem better equipped to handle these moral complexities. They've always understood that team success sometimes requires individual sacrifice, that difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good, that survival often depends on making choices that feel wrong but are strategically necessary. They can compartmentalize their emotions, focus on practical necessities, and maintain group cohesion even when doing things that violate their deepest moral convictions. On November 29th, something happens that changes the dynamic of the entire ordeal. An avalanche, triggered by warming temperatures and unstable snow conditions, buries the aircraft fuselage and traps the survivors inside for 3 days. 8 more people die in the avalanche, including several of the strongest and most capable survivors. The avalanche isn't just a natural disaster, it's a psychological breaking point. The survivors who remain are the most desperate, the most depleted, the least capable of organizing effective group action. Food supplies, which were already critically low, are now stretched among fewer people, but are also running out entirely. The bodies of the original crash victims have been consumed, and now the avalanche victims provide the only source of nutrition. You barely survived the avalanche, and when you're finally dug out, you're showing advanced signs of malnutrition, hypothermia, and psychological breakdown. Your body weight has dropped by probably 30%, your muscle mass has deteriorated significantly, and your mental capacity is seriously impaired. You're operating on reserves that don't exist, burning energy you don't have, trying to function with a brain that isn't getting adequate nutrition or oxygen. The 8 remaining survivors represent the hardest core of the group, young men who have demonstrated exceptional physical resilience, mental toughness, and psychological adaptability. They're the ones who were best equipped for this ordeal from the beginning, and they're the only ones who have managed to adapt successfully to the escalating demands of long-term survival. You're not one of them, not really. You're alive, but just barely, and your presence has become more of a liability than an asset to group survival. You require more help than you can provide, consume more resources than you contribute, and your psychological condition is beginning to affect group morale. In animal terms, you've become the weak member of the herd, the one who slows down the group and attracts predators. On December 12th, 2 of the strongest survivors, Nando Paraido and Roberto Canessa, make the decision that will ultimately save the remaining members of the group. They will leave the crash site and attempt to walk out of the mountains, seeking rescue for those who cannot travel. It's a desperate gambit. They'll be traveling on foot through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, with minimal equipment and no guarantee that they'll find help before they freeze or starve. But it's also the only realistic option. The remaining survivors are too weak to survive much longer, and there's no indication that rescue teams are still looking for them. Someone has to make the journey, and it has to be the people with the best chance of actually making it out alive. Paredo and Canessa are the obvious choices. They're young, strong, experienced in physical challenges, and psychologically resilient. They have the kind of determination that comes from years of competitive sports, the ability to push through pain and exhaustion that separates elite athletes from ordinary people. They understand pacing, nutrition management, and the mental techniques necessary to maintain focus during extended physical ordeals. You watch them prepare for the journey with a mixture of admiration and despair. You know you couldn't make this trek even under ideal conditions, let alone in your current physical state. The distance they'll have to travel is approximately 40 miles through mountain terrain, but those 40 miles include glaciers, avalanche zones, river crossings, and altitude changes that would challenge professional mountaineers with full equipment and support teams. They fashion equipment from pieces of the aircraft, makeshift sleeping bags from seat cushions, walking sticks from metal struts, snow goggles from sunglasses and electrical tape. Their preparations are methodical, practical, focused entirely on the essentials necessary for survival. They're not taking anything unnecessary, not wasting energy on comfort items or sentimental objects. Your contribution to their preparation consists mainly of staying out of the way and trying not to require too much attention from the other survivors. You're beyond the point where you could be helpful, and you know it. Your role has become that of a spectator to your own survival, someone who is experiencing these events but not really participating in them. On December 12th, Paraido and Canessa begin their trek west toward Chile, carrying improvised equipment and the hopes of everyone they're leaving behind. The remaining survivors watch them disappear into the white vastness of the mountains, knowing that their own survival now depends entirely on the success of two young men walking into terrain that has killed professional expeditions. You spend the following days in a state that can best be described as conscious hibernation. You're alive, but you're not really living. Your body is consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue and organ function to maintain basic brain activity. Your psychological condition has deteriorated to the point where you're barely aware of your surroundings, existing in a kind of waking dream where reality and hallucination blend together. The other remaining survivors are in slightly better condition, but not by much. They've organized a minimal routine sharing body heat, rationing the last scraps of available food, maintaining the basic hygiene and medical care necessary to prevent immediate death. But they're also clearly dying, just more slowly than you are. The waiting is perhaps the worst part. You don't know if Paraido and Canessa are still alive, if they've found help, if rescue teams are on their way, or if you're simply waiting to die in a place where your bodies will never be found. Time loses meaning when every day is identical, when your primary activities consist of sleeping, eating tiny portions of food, and trying not to think about how hungry you are. On December 20th, you hear something that sounds like a hallucination, the sound of helicopters in the distance. The noise grows louder, more distinct, until it's unmistakably real. Helicopters are approaching the crash site, which means Paraido and Canessa made it out alive, found help, and guided rescue teams back to the survivors. The helicopters can't land directly at the crash site due to the altitude and terrain, but they're able to hover close enough to drop supplies and rescue personnel. The sight of other human beings, people who aren't starving or dying or psychologically broken, is almost overwhelming. These are professional rescue workers, clean and well, fed and equipped with modern technology, and they represent everything you've been dreaming about for the past 72 days. But here's the thing about rescue operations in extreme environments: they're not like the movies. The helicopter pilots are dealing with dangerous flying conditions, unpredictable mountain weather, and the technical challenge of extracting people from a location that was never meant to be accessible to aircraft. The rescue process is going to be slow, methodical, and conducted according to tried principles that prioritize the survivors most likely to benefit from immediate medical attention. You are not one of those survivors. Your physical condition has deteriorated to the point where you represent what medical professionals call a resource-intensive case with uncertain outcomes. In plainer terms, you're probably going to die anyway, and the time and equipment required to extract you might be better spent saving someone with better survival prospects. The rescue teams make these calculations constantly, and while they're not heartless, they are pragmatic. The rugby players who have survived this long are, predictably, given priority for evacuation. They're young, resilient, and despite their ordeal, they're still in relatively good physical condition compared to you. Their vital signs are stronger, their psychological state is more stable, and their chances of surviving the helicopter flight and subsequent medical treatment are significantly higher. You watch the first helicopter lift off with 3 survivors aboard, including Roberto Canessa, whose medical knowledge and leadership helped keep the group alive. The sound of the rotor blades fading into the distance is both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because it means rescue is real. Terrifying because you're still sitting on a glacier at 11,500 feet above sea level with no guarantee that the helicopters will return before weather conditions deteriorate. Mountain weather is notoriously unpredictable, and the rescue teams are working against a narrow window of opportunity. Clouds are already beginning to form around the peaks, and the wind is picking up in a way that suggests another storm system moving in. If the weather turns bad, the helicopters won't be able to return, and you'll be left to wait out another storm cycle with even fewer survivors and no food. The second helicopter arrives about an hour later, and you're selected for evacuation along with 2 other survivors. The process of getting you from the crash site to the helicopter is more complex than you anticipated. You can't walk under your own power. 2 days of malnutrition and exposure have left you barely capable of standing, let alone navigating the uneven terrain between the fuselage and the helicopter landing zone. 2 rescue workers have to carry you, and you're dimly aware that you've become a burden on people who are risking their own lives to save you. The altitude affects them too, and carrying your dead weight across a glacier while wearing heavy equipment and breathing thin air is exhausting work. You want to tell them you're grateful, but you're not sure you can form coherent words anymore. The helicopter ride to civilization is a blur of sensation and disorientation. The machine is loud, vibrating, and filled with medical equipment that the rescue paramedics use to monitor your vital signs and provide emergency treatment. You're hooked up to IV lines, oxygen masks, monitoring devices that beep and flash with information about bodily functions you can no longer feel. The paramedic working on you has the expression of someone dealing with a challenging case. Your blood pressure is dangerously low, your heart rate is irregular, and your body temperature is well below normal despite the blankets and warming devices they've deployed. You're showing signs of multiple organ failure, advanced malnutrition, and severe dehydration. In medical terms, you're circling the drain. Through the helicopter window, you can see the mountains falling away below, the white expanse of glaciers and peaks that have been your entire world for the past 2.5 months. From this altitude, the crash site is invisible, just another anonymous patch of snow and rock in an endless wilderness. It's hard to believe that 16 people managed to survive there for 72 days, and even harder to believe that you were one of them. The flight to the hospital takes about 40 minutes, and during that time, you drift in and out of consciousness. The combination of medical treatment, altitude change, and psychological relief creates a dreamlike state where reality seems negotiable. You're aware of voices, medical discussions about your condition, radio communications with the hospital, but none of it seems entirely real. The hospital in Santiago represents everything you've been fantasizing about during your time on the glacier: warmth, cleanliness, professional medical care, and unlimited food. But your arrival there is less triumphant than you imagined. You're immediately taken to an intensive care unit, where a team of doctors and nurses begins the complex process of treating someone who has survived extreme starvation and exposure. Your body has adapted to survival conditions in ways that make refeeding dangerous. After 72 days of minimal nutrition, your digestive system has essentially shut down, and introducing normal food too quickly can cause fatal complications. Your electrolyte balance is severely disrupted. Your muscle mass has been consumed by your own metabolism, and your organs are operating on the edge of failure. The medical team has to essentially teach your body how to process nutrition again, starting with carefully measured amounts of simple sugars and gradually working up to more complex foods. The process takes weeks, and there are several points where your condition becomes critical enough that the doctors aren't sure you're going to survive the rescue. Meanwhile, the rugby players who were evacuated before you are already showing signs of recovery. Their younger age, better physical condition, and superior nutritional reserves before the crash have given them significant advantages in terms of medical treatment. They respond well to refeeding protocols, their organ function returns to normal relatively quickly, and their psychological resilience helps them process the trauma of their experience. You spend 3 weeks in intensive care, hovering between life and death, while your body slowly remembers how to function in a world with adequate food and medical care. The psychological adjustment is almost as difficult as the physical recovery. After 72 days of thinking primarily about immediate survival, the return to normal civilization feels surreal and overwhelming. The media attention is intense but also troubling. The story of the Andes survivors captures international attention, but the focus is inevitably on the most dramatic aspects of the ordeal: the plane crash, the decision to resort to cannibalism, the heroic trek by Paraido and Canessa to find rescue. Your role in the story is minimal, which is probably accurate given your limited contribution to the group's survival. The rugby players become celebrities, invited to speak at events, write books, and share their story with the world. Their experience is transformed into a narrative about human resilience, teamwork, and the triumph of the human spirit over impossible odds. It's an inspiring story, and they deserve the recognition they receive. Your experience is somewhat different. You survived, which is an achievement in itself, but you also know that your survival was largely due to the strength and determination of other people. You were carried through the ordeal by young men who were better equipped physically, mentally, and emotionally to handle extreme adversity. Without them, you would have died within the first week. This realization is both humbling and disturbing. You've learned things about yourself that you probably would have preferred not to know, that your physical condition is poor, your mental resilience is limited, and your ability to contribute to group survival is minimal. You've discovered that you're not the protagonist of your own survival story, but rather a supporting character who was fortunate enough to be rescued along with the actual heroes. The long-term psychological effects of the experience are complex and persistent. You have nightmares about the cold, about hunger, about the taste of human flesh. You develop anxiety around food, both the fear of not having enough and the guilt associated with having enough. Normal social situations feel strange and artificial after spending 72 days in a life or death survival scenario. You also struggle with what psychologists call survivor guilt, the feeling that you don't deserve to have lived when others died, combined with the knowledge that your survival depended on consuming the bodies of people who were probably better human beings than you are. The moral complexities of cannibalism don't become simpler with time and perspective. If anything, they become more troubling as you return to a world where such choices seem unthinkable. The rugby players seem to handle these psychological challenges better than you do. They have the framework of team sports to help them process the experience. They understand shared sacrifice, collective responsibility, and the idea that sometimes you do things you don't want to do for the sake of the group. They also have each other, a network of people who shared the same experience and can provide mutual support and understanding. You don't have that same support network. You weren't really part of their team before the crash, and you're not part of their post-rescue community. You're a peripheral figure in their story, someone who happened to be on the same airplane, but who didn't contribute significantly to the collective survival effort. This isolation makes the psychological recovery process more difficult and more lonely. Years later, when you're asked to reflect on the experience, you're forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature, about your own limitations, and about the arbitrary nature of survival in extreme situations. You survived not because you were strong or clever or morally superior, but because you were fortunate enough to be surrounded by people who were all of those things. The rugby players who died in the crash, or during the 72 days on the glacier, weren't weaker or less deserving of survival, they were simply unlucky. Some died from injuries that were beyond anyone's ability to treat, others from diseases or complications that could have affected anyone, a few from the accumulated stress of trying to survive in impossible conditions. Your survival was largely a matter of chance, combined with the extraordinary efforts of people who were better equipped to handle the situation than you were. This is both a humbling realization and a troubling one, because it suggests that survival in extreme situations has less to do with individual merit than most people want to believe. The story of Flight 571 is ultimately about the best of human nature, about young men who faced impossible odds and managed to keep each other alive through courage, determination, and mutual sacrifice. It's about people who made difficult moral choices and maintained their humanity even when doing things that violated their deepest beliefs. But it's also a story about the harsh realities of survival, about the fact that not everyone is equally equipped to handle extreme adversity, and about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the difference between life and death is simply being in the right place at the right time with the right people. You were fortunate to be one of the survivors, but you also know that your fortune was largely dependent on the strength and sacrifice of others. The rugby players saved your life, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through the accumulated effect of their superior physical condition, mental resilience, and ability to work together under pressure. In the end, the experience taught you more about your limitations than your strengths, more about your dependence on others than your individual capabilities, and more about the arbitrary nature of survival than the heroic narratives that people prefer to tell about such ordeals. You survived Flight 571, but you also learned that survival isn't always about personal heroism or individual strength. Sometimes it's about being lucky enough to be surrounded by people who are stronger, smarter, and more capable than you are, and hoping that their efforts are sufficient to keep everyone alive until rescue arrives. The rugby players were those people, and your survival is a testament to their extraordinary resilience rather than your own. This is a difficult truth to accept, but it's also an important one, because it acknowledges the reality that survival in extreme situations often depends more on group dynamics and collective action than on individual heroism. You made it home, eventually, after months of medical treatment and psychological counseling. You returned to a normal life, with normal concerns and normal challenges. But you also carried with you the knowledge of what you learned about yourself during those 72 days on the glacier, knowledge that was uncomfortable, but ultimately valuable. You learned that you're not as strong as you thought you were, not as resilient as you hoped you would be, and not as capable of handling extreme adversity as you had imagined. But you also learned that survival is possible even for people like you, provided you're fortunate enough to be surrounded by people who are stronger, more determined, and more capable of making the difficult decisions that extreme situations require. The rugby players of the Old Christians Club saved your life and the lives of 15 other people through their extraordinary courage, determination, and mutual support. They deserve all the recognition and admiration they have received over the years since the crash. You were just lucky enough to be along for the ride.